I made this presentation about 2 years ago. It follows basically the publication of the Thorndale Coal Wharf article that appeared in the High Line in 2009. That would be the winter edition. And the story of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Thorndale Coal Wharf in Cowan Township, Chester County, actually begins in East Whiteland Township, west of Paoli. The earliest steam locomotives from their inception in the 1830s until the 1850s burned wood in their fireboxes to create steam in their boilers. The PRR was chartered on April 13, 1846, and took over the canals, inclined planes, and rail lines of the already established main line of public works constructed from 1826 to 1834, which connected Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. The PRR experimented with the use of bituminous coal as a fuel between 1853 and 1859, when it concluded that coal was a satisfactory replacement for wood. And 5 years later, by 1864, all the locomotives on the PRR system had been converted for the use of coal. Trains westbound from Philadelphia on the main line carried a full load of coal and water received at either the West Philadelphia yards or in later years at the 46th Street engine terminal for servicing facilities. The westward climb on the stiff mainline grade out of the city of Philadelphia taxed both the coal and water capacities of the steam motive power of that time period. So a coal wharf was constructed at Glenlock in East Whiteland, which can be seen in this map extract from A.H. Mueller's 1897 Atlas of Properties on the PRR main line from Rosemont to Westchester. And let me see if I can point out with the laser here. Here is the current day Glenlock station. Here is the coal wharf right there, shown across the double tracks. There is a Victorian stone mansion called Loch Erie. And today, at this location here, there's a Home Depot. Here is the coal wharf in a view looking west toward Downingtown, taken about 1899. The Glenlock Coal Wharf was built in 1873 and modified in the late 1870s to what you see here. I'll show some enlargements of the coal wharf in the next few slides, but here are some of the wharf details. Let me point out GH Tower. Right here, obviously, and GH here for Glenlock, first letter G, last letter H. These are the two coal, coal chutes, each of them handling 2 tracks. And these are here's 4 of the coal wagons, I think, that are rolled out onto the wharf to provide coal for these coal pockets there. Next. And an enlargement of the last photograph, you can see 4 of the many 4-wheel narrow gauge coal wagons that were hand filled with coal and emptied into the coal chutes through a drop bottom gate when the locomotive would pull under the wharf for servicing. The cars held about 4 to 5 tons of coal, and each locomotive of that time period took about 3.5 to 4 tons of coal, about 95 bushels. And the bushel of coal weighed about 80 pounds, and all that work is all hand work. Next. For you PRR motive power historians, here's a class F1 number 242, built in the PRR's Juniata shops in 1897. That was just completed coaling under the wharf and will back to its train to continue its run east in the circa 1904 photograph. Next. This is a PRR real estate department plan of the track layout of Glenlock, dated August 10th, 1900, showing the coal wharf. You can see right there across the main 4 tracks, the coal storage bins, a 60-foot diameter cistern about 12 feet deep, which fed the water plugs under the wharf to replenish the locomotive tendons. The narrow gauge tracks on top of the wharf and adjacent coal bins were almost perfectly level to facilitate easy movement of the coal wagons on and off of the wharf by hand or use of a winch. Coal was brought to the wharf to fill the bins by horse-drawn wagons from local purveyors contracted by the railroad to keep a steady supply. Note how the main wharf track and the 5 coal bin storage tracks are joined at right angle intersections. To allow access to the 5 tracks in the coal storage area, small hand-operated turntables were used at each intersection of the Wharf track with a coal bin track. A 4-wheel car would only have to be turned 90 degrees to access either the east or west side of the storage tracks. They would be loaded by hand shoveling. And an early photograph looking east of the westbound Pennsylvania Limited, powered by what appears to be a Class D16 locomotive, easing into the curve just west of the coal wharf, visible in the distance at the upper right side of the photograph. Next. Glenlock Station, as it appears today, was restored as a single-family home about 25 years ago when the adjacent coal wharf property was developed for single-family homes. Steam power on the railroad had developed in the late part of the 19th century to much larger passenger and freight classes of locomotives, whose tenders had almost 100% greater capacities for coal and water. The PRR planned a new coaling facility 10.6 miles west of Glenlock at Thorndale to service these larger locomotives that could handle much longer trains. The railroad closed the Glenlock coal wharf in 1906 and dismantled it by March of 1907. All the men employed at Glenlock were transferred to the site of the new coal wharf, nearing completion at Thorndale, already servicing locomotives. No portion of the old wharf was to be used at the new site. Next. And here's the massive Thorndale coal wharf in the 1906 view looking west toward Coatesville. Construction of this structure was begun in 1905 and completed in 1906, spanning 12 tracks, theoretically being able to service 6 trains in each direction at the same time, but from a logical standpoint, about 4 in each direction serviced. It was 325 feet in length, measured from the face of the south stone abutment to the north end of the wharf nearest Lancaster Pike. The top deck working surface was 28 feet wide and 40 feet above the 12 track rails below. The Lancaster Turnpike is to the right of the wharf, but not visible below the level of the railroad in this photograph. The Class H6 280 locomotive can be seen setting loaded cars above the coal pockets and was the heaviest locomotive permitted on the wharf. The wharf capacity was 1,050 tons of coal, which was the second largest on the eastern region. Only the East Altoona coaling facility, which was a totally different design, was larger and 12,000 ton capacity. Let me point out a few things with the laser here, if I can. These are the discharge chutes for the 6 coal pockets, each of them servicing 2 tracks. This is the ash house here. Below the ash house, there's a hopper car to receive the ash bins. The spent ashes. This is the sand drying tower. There's a twin 35,000 gallon water storage tank of PRR design. And across the bottom of the wharf, there are 14 standpipes for water. And off to the far right, you see a utility line there, which is actually along the Lancaster Turnpike, which is about 10 feet below grade on this photograph. Now look carefully at the photograph and compare it to the next one, paying close attention to the right side of the structure. Next. This is the Denholm coal wharf, which is almost identical to Thorndale's and was constructed at the same time for the same plans and specifications. The Thorndale coal wharf is on the PRR's Philadelphia division, while Denholm is on the middle division, which extends from Marysville, just west of Harrisburg, to Altoona. Denholm is located just west of Mifflintown on the south side of the Gianantonio River, just east of the Lewistown Narrows. This view is looking east toward Mifflintown, Pennsylvania, with the Gianantonio River out of view to the left. And I'll reference Denholm later in this presentation. Back to Thorndale, here's a west side of the Thorndale wharf looking east toward Downingtown. Here you have a better view of the powerhouse, a view of CS Tower right in the middle. CS stood for coaling station. Next. And this is a June 30th, 1918 valuation map of the railroad through the wharf area. The Valuation Act was the United States federal law passed in 1913 that required the Interstate Commerce Commission to assess the value of all railroad property in the country. This information would be used to set fare rates for the transport of freight on all railroads in the United States. And let me mention a few things and point out some things about the track numbering system on the Pennsylvania Railroad. There were four main tracks, or four mainline tracks through Thorndale at the time the coal wharf was built, two westbound and two eastbound. Starting from Lancaster Pike, which is up on the north side of this, the upper part of this plan, and going south, they were numbered 4, 3, 2, and 1. Again, 4 and 3 being the westbound tracks, 2 and 1 being the eastbound tracks. Now, at the beginning of the project, the eastbound tracks 2 and 1 were relocated far to the south area of the new yard, so that all new yard tracks that were could be constructed in the now wide open central part of the yard. And that will be all throughout this area that I illustrated here. Let me point out here the coal wharf location, which is on the far right here. South Town Road will go over to the far left, or South Town Road. This plan doesn't quite go to the west where the railroad crosses Lancaster Pike. But on the west side are, lost my cursor, there were 7 houses here built by the Pennsylvania Railroad to house the foreman and some of the track workers. And this track is number 1 track relocation, which started just east of where Route 30 crosses the railroad and went all the way to the far right up the trip for any any trains that were through trains. Diverging from the number 2 track, there were 2 tracks that came off there and went up and were called the circle track. And that goes all the way to the top of the wharf. They climbed an elevation to direct loaded hopper cars to the top of the wharf. And from the top of the wharf, we had the return track that was a slightly steeper grade that brought the empty cars back down to grade so that they can be taken mostly to the west and refilled with coal. There's a water storage reservoir shown here. There's a little gatehouse or valve house right there. There's a 40-foot by 100-foot powerhouse. That's right, the powerhouse. And at the very north, the very upper part of the drawing, there's the Westchester Street Railway that followed Route 30 Lancaster Turnpike on the north side of the turnpike. Next. The powerhouse was located on the west side of the wharf adjacent to the ash house and was 40 feet wide by 100 feet long of standard PRR design. It was the duplicate of the Denholm powerhouse and housed a 100 kW generator that produced 220 volt DC power, a boiler room of 3 steam boilers that were from the tired PRR class H3 steam locomotives, a coal bunker, a lunchroom, foreman's office, washroom, and locker room. The boiler room was on the southwest corner of the powerhouse under the 2 tall stacks and was 1 story below the main floor level. A wall separated it from the generator room, which occupied the center portion of the building. One of the 3 locomotive boilers provided steam for anywhere it was needed on the wharf. Another provided the 100 kW generator, and the third was a standby boiler kept in full working order as an emergency use spare. Coal to fuel the boiler was dropped from a loaded hopper car, spotted on track right beside the front of the powerhouse, into a coal bin that you can see at this location. In this photo, its access was between the far 2 windows on the front of the powerhouse where the wall brick is stained black from the coal dust. It's right there. Next. An ash hoist was located on the west side of the powerhouse to lift a small clamshell bucket out of the below-ground boiler level of the building and dump it into the ash gondola or hopper car spotted beside the building. The bucket had opening bottom gates to release its ashes to the gondola. Now here's the hoist frame across the top. Here's the hoist trolley. And if you look very closely, you can see 2 of the lightly colored cables that are going down to the lower level of the an ash house or an ash hoist It was located on, I'm sorry. In this 1906 photograph shows a 10-foot diameter by 65-foot high sand drying tower on the left. A large steel and reinforced concrete ash house on the right with a V-shaped ash bunker and a hopper car slotted under it to receive the ashes for disposal. Note the four large vertical rectangular sheet steel ducts, two on each side of the track, extending from ground level to the building above the concrete ash bunker. These ducts carry the ash conveyor belt chains from ash tunnels, or ash collection tunnels that ran under the 12 tracks to the ash house. The bucket chains with loaded buckets would rise vertically from the tunnel and the ducts to the right of the hopper car, cross over the ash bunker where an automatic tripping mechanism would dump the ashes from each bucket into the ash bunker as the chain passed over it, and these send down the two ducts to the left of the hopper car back into the tunnels. Next. The ash bucket chains are probably one of the most interesting parts of the coal wharf facilities. Here's the opening slide from this presentation showing the eastbound Class I winds 210 freight locomotive number 4605 taking on coal at Thorndale in the late 20s. The 4605 was a vaulted product from Eddystone built in October 1923. Between the locomotive and the photographer's location are two ash pits between the track rails where ashes from the locomotive's firebox are dropped by the wharf workers when the locomotive stops for servicing. The ash pits are lined with metal and brick to prevent the wooden track ties from catching fire from hot ash embers. Next. When cooled, the ashes are dropped into the ash bucket conveyor chain in one of the two ash tunnels that are perpendicular to and below the tracks. These next few shots were taken in the one tunnel that is still somewhat accessible today, even though the conveyor chain and buckets were removed long ago. The tunnels are 17 feet wide with 4 to 5 foot vertical reinforced concrete sidewalls and a multi-course brick arch about 7 feet high in the middle, supporting the rail yard and tracks above. And as you can see, there's a 12-inch stormwater line that runs through the tunnel that's still in active service today. In this view, the remaining 10 clamshell gates that allow the ashes to fall into the ash chain buckets can be seen on the right. But the chain supporting structure, rails, and buckets that were right below the gates have all been removed. The rear of the tunnel also appears to have collapsed or has been intentionally filled in by the railroad. Next. The close-up of the gates, some of which still have their actual gates in place. The gates were manually operated by a rod from ground level or could be operated from workers in the tunnels. Next. And the first two gates, the closest with the rusty gear portion of the right gate still visible, but rotated downward. The second one with the gate still attached is in its normally closed position. Next. Here's the north bucket chain anchor steel that supported the chain tensioning mechanism. On the bottom left, leaning against the anchor steel, are 4 of the chain rail system base supports that were anchored to the floor of the tunnel and carried the chain rails. Next. And here are the tensioning devices and anchored to the vertical concrete wall on the right, which is adjacent to the Lancaster Turnpike. The closest one is missing several of its parts. The ash bucket chains were manufactured by the McCaslin Conveyor Company, I believe, in New York company. Next. And this is what the bucket chain conveyor system most likely looked at. Let me see if I can point out here. These were the support wheels for the buckets, and you notice they are mounted in the center of the buckets so that the buckets could rotate and always remain level. Here are the rails that the bucket chain rode on. Here are the lifting lugs or the tilting lugs that would follow a cam at the top of the bucket, and there are links that held the buckets together in one long chain. Next. And here illustrated here is an example of a typical endless bucket chain installation to deliver coal to, in this case, the Brooklyn Waterworks building coal bunkers in New York. Next. And here is the upper part of the Denholm ash house under construction in 1906, showing the bucket chain drive motor on the right and the upper loop the bucket chain at center with two buckets in their tip position above the ash bucket. And this was the driving mechanism on the right, and here are the two buckets that tipped down the ash and came across the top and then went back down into the ash house. Next. The sand tower was used to dry all the sand delivered to the wharf by heating the sand using multiple steam pipes in a large, airtight pressurized bin in the central portion of the tower. The dry sand in the pressurized bin was delivered by a 2-inch steel line to each of the 12 coaling locations where it would flow easily into the sand domes on the steam locomotives through a 4-inch rubber hose when needed. Sand between the wheels or between the drivers and railhead locomotives use sand blown between the drivers and railhead by compressed air to get traction on wet or icy rails. And here's an excellent view of the upper level of the wharf looking north with the sand tower and ash house prominent in the photo. Both empty and loaded coal cars were sometimes needed to be moved on the wharf when no locomotives were available. So heavy ropes and an electric winch were used to move them. The straight track leading from the right of the switch in this photo is the circle track, which brought loaded cars onto the wharf. And the track coming toward the photographer was the return track, which brought the empties back down to ground level. And for those of you familiar with this area, the tree-lined road on the left leading to the north is current-day Barley Sheaf Road. Next. And this is an enlarged view of the prior photo showing the winch at the base of the right light pole, two loaded hoppers on the wharf, and the coal chute operating deck at the lower left. The coal pocket openings in the deck under the track were 8 feet wide by 10 feet long to allow coal to fill the bunker when released from the hoppers. And here we have an aerial view of the complete coal wharf property, where clearly visible is the coal wharf in the upper right, track, you can see there, the return track, the oval storage reservoir, and that little bright spot is the valve house or gate house as the Pennsylvania Railroad checkpoint boulder. Next. An oval reservoir about 150 feet wide, 250 feet long, and about 20 feet deep was constructed on the hillside between the circle track and the return track and fed the trackside twin 35,000-gallon wooden water storage tanks, which fed the water standpipes. The inside of the reservoir was lined with grouted stone from the bottom of the inside slope to the high water levels to prevent erosion as the water level changed through daily use. The reservoir held 2,008,000 gallons of water, and this is a photo merged panoramic view of 3 photographs that I took inside the basin. Next. A 15-foot diameter stone valve house, or like I said, gate house, with an ornate terracotta flared cone-shaped roof with a ball finial was installed on the north side of the reservoir with control valves to control all water flow to the wharf. This is a view up the return track with the fenced reservoir on the upper right. Next. And a close-up view of the valve house as built. Detail of the terracotta roof, the design was a tile design with numbered tiles, and there were 19 courses of tile. Next. The valve house in recent times showing the north side. And side, and the valve house from the inside with copious amounts of graffiti, as you might imagine. Next. And the valve pit with 2 valves showing and miscellaneous debris. There's 2 16-inch valves, one here on the right, one here on the left, and they had extensions that you can see here that went up the wheels on the floor level of the valve house. And this approximately 4-foot diameter bin here was a filter that filtered out all debris from the reservoir as the water was used. Next. Let's see. Yeah, this illustrates a hairpin fence that was around the entire reservoir. Next. There was an entrance gate near the valve house. That's probably why it was called the gatehouse. That was divided in a hairpin fence. The right-hand gate support embedded in the tree, which basically was good proof of the age of the whole facility. It was fed by a 24-inch cast iron pipe from a water treatment plant and pumping station constructed by the PRR in 1903. This plant and pumping station, called McCrae's Dam, pumped to a 10 million gallon reservoir at Mars Hill, which was just south of the PRR's Atglen and Susquehanna branch in Bart Township, Lancaster County. The pumping station and reservoir were located on the west branch of the Octorara Creek, 20 miles to the southwest of Thorndale, just east of Quarryville. And due to the high elevation of the Mars Hill Reservoir, actually 335 feet above Thorndale, the 24-inch water line flowed all by gravity following PRR's A&S branch east to Atglen, and then east along the main line through Parksburg and Coatesville to Thorndale. Next. A unique structure was constructed as part of the Coal Wharf stormwater drainage system. Adjacent to the north end of the Coal Wharf and within several feet of the newly constructed Westchester Street Railway track running between Downingtown and Coatesville, the PRR constructed an in-ground concrete tank 300 feet long and 15 feet wide with half-round ends. The perimeter walls were approximately 6 feet in height and 18 inches thick. Inside the tank were two separate concrete baffle walls approximately 3 feet in height and 1 foot thick. And the interior walls were arranged so that stormwater collected from the wharf area and discharged to the tank through an approximately 24-inch concrete pipe traversed an S-shaped path 600 feet in length before it left the railroad property. It was piped. Yeah, here's a settling tank close-up, basically, on the prior slide. Water came out of the railroad. Forget this pipe here on the right. That's just an extraneous piece. But the water came out between these two walls here and followed up toward the east end of the tank, around the east end, crossed over in the middle, back down, and all the way over to the left end tank, and went about 600 feet before it exited through a 30-inch pipe to the north grounds beyond Route 30. And if you notice, you can see some of them here on the left. Stone baffles were placed approximately every 20 feet in an attempt to allow sediment of all types to settle out of the water before it reached the discharge end of the tank. And obviously, no doubt, some ash and cinder particles would most likely have little effect on oil and grease drippings from the locomotives. Next. Here's another photo earlier of a work crew under the north end of the wharf and the tank in place before the electric railway was built, probably early 1906. The light-colored concrete wall retaining the railroad embankment near the center of the photograph is still there today. And that's this wall right here, and that gains access to the tunnels. Next. And a shot of Lancaster Pike, some distance west of the Coal Wharf before either the settling tank or trolley line were built. Probably late 1905, and at that point, Lancaster Turnpike was still an all-dirt road. Next. At about 3:00 a.m. on the Sunday morning of June 16, 1907, an unfortunate accident occurred at the Coal Wharf which stopped all traffic on both the Lancaster Turnpike and the Westchester Street Railway. Workmen on the right or on the night shift were bringing 3 loaded coal cars down from the circle track, which was higher in elevation than the wharf track, allowing the cars to roll by gravity. As standard operating procedure, brakemen rode the cars and would control their move by use of their hand-operated brake wheels and stop them as close to the openings for the coal pockets as possible. On that dark Sunday morning, 17 loaded cars, from which the first 3 were uncoupled, broke loose of their own accord, their circle track, onto the wharf track, striking the first 3, and all 20 cars rolled off the end of the wharf, severing the trolley wire and pole lines of the Westchester Street Railway and piling more than 800 tons of coal and steel hopper cars into the settling basin and all across the Lancaster Turnpike. But fortunately, no workers were injured in the accident. Next. Wrecked trains were called in from both Parksburg to the west and Paola to the east, and the clearing was carried on all day Sunday, providing entertainment for hundreds of local residents who, hearing of the accident, came to the scene on foot or by horseback or carriage. The two westbound main tracks were cleared by the end of the day Sunday, and the Westchester Street Railway shortly thereafter by moving the debris aside and restringing the trolley wire. Work continued for the next 2 weeks to July 1st in clearing the coal and mangled cars from the Lancaster Turnpike and settling basin. Next. And here are some more of the onlookers standing on the edge of the filtration basin watching the cleanup. Next. I mentioned earlier on the side of the valuation plan that the PRR constructed residential housing for some of its workers. Here are the 7 twin housing units constructed on the east end of Olive Street, looking toward the east. There are 6 on Olive Street and 1 east of them on South Cal Road across the Williamson Dunlap House, which was a historically significant home in Cam Township. And here are the 6 Olive Street dwellings looking from the west. Obviously, you can't see all 6 in one shot. Next. And the 6 identical dwellings constructed for the Denholm coal workers on the west side of that wharf, which I mentioned earlier. Next. This aerial photograph taken in mid-1915 shows a massive buildup of coal storage at Thorndale, which was a mystery to all who saw it. Contain the following description of the coal storage mystery, and I quote, "The Pennsylvania Railroad Company is unloading thousands of tons of coal at the Thorndale coal chutes of the company. In fact, many more tons than its chutes will hold. The coal is being piled on tracks not in use and will have to be moved on when needed. It is said that this feverish haste to store up coal is due to the fact that next spring the miners will submit new schedules of wages with considerable increased rates, and that such a surplus would be very acceptable in case of a strike." Another rumor, even more vague and tenuous, intimates that the railroads have been tipped off by the government to prepare for all possible emergencies. End quote. Even the Reading Railroad was storing coal in all possible places, including Kenilworth, Spring City, and Phoenixville here in Chester County. The reason was soon realized. Next. The sinking of Britain's Cunard liner Lusitania on May 17, 1915, by a German submarine prior to America entering World War I. Of the 1,959 passengers and crew aboard, 1,128 perished, 128 of them Americans. The sinking and other issues contributed to our country's entering the war on April 6, 1917. The United States fought in the war until Germany surrendered on Armistice Day, November 11, 1918. So the First World War lasted about 19 months. Next. I mentioned CS Tower earlier, which stood for Coaling Station, which controlled all the train movements around the coal wharf. It was originally built in 1906 as a one-story structure and expanded to a 2-story tower a year or so later to provide a better view of the train movements in the wharf area. There were 3 towers that controlled all traffic to the coal wharf. HD Tower, shown here, was built in 1906. HD Tower controlled westbound train movements entering Thorndale Yard and was named after Hazelwood Avenue, which runs along the south side of the railroad. First letter H, last letter D. Next. VA Tower, or Valley Tower, was located on the west end of the Thorndale Yard, adjacent to South Town Road, and controlled all of the eastbound train movements entering the yard from the west. It was physically located between the tracks on the east side of the South Town Road underpass, behind what is now Jack's Pizza Restaurant, for those of you familiar with the area. And here are several more interesting wharf photographs, of which there are many more in the collection, but generally showing the same views as already presented. This is a winter view of the north end of the wharf, where the railroad has erected a corrugated metal wall across the full length of the west side of the top deck to protect the workers from chilling winds. The wall may have been removed each year in the summertime. Note the stair on the left to the wharf operating deck, which has 34 steps. Yes, that's right. I counted them. They were duplicated. The walls were duplicated at Denholm also for wintertime use. Next. And the south end of the wharf the same day. Note in the center of the wharf on the operating deck, a small shelter has been constructed to provide some foul weather protection. That's right here. You can barely see it. There's its window right there. Complete view of the north end of the wharf about 1915 from the Lancaster Turnpike, showing the Westchester Electric Railway track and the wall of the stormwater basin. The stair seen earlier is no longer there, or has possibly not yet been built, depending on the date of this photo, which is not accurately known. Next. And here's the north end of the wharf with two locomotives uncoupled from their westbound trains and in position for coaling. Note the men on the operating deck above the right locomotive opening the coal chute. And obviously it must be early in their shift. Their shirts were still white. Next. Sometimes the coal would jam in the hopper cars and have to be loosened with picks, shovels, and tamping bars by the wharf workers before it would fall into the coal pot. This work at least. Next. And men working on the semaphore signal system adjacent to the eastbound main track, number 1, which communicated to passing trains whether or not the track was clear ahead. Note near the top of the signal, a somewhat chunky worker above the bottom semaphore arm with what appears to be a safety rope to the right side of the support pole, extending from him to the somewhat skinny worker on the ground. And I wonder in my own mind if they compared body weights before the pole was climbed to work on the signal. Think about that. Next. Looking to the west toward Coatesville, an eastbound freight on track 1 on the left, passing under the circle track bridge with a work train on the siding. The circle track climbs to the coal wharf on the grade ascending to the left on top of the earth fill and bridge. Next. And here's a grade enlargement showing 11 men going about their assigned tasks, typical of the everyday coal wharf operation. And if we zoom in on several of the areas of the photo, next. There's 2 men in CS Tower, one looking out the right side of the tower, and one with apparently a formal white collar and bow tie on the left side. Next. And here's one ash pick worker next to the ash pit on the left, and he's in motion. I guess this is a little bit of a time photograph. And a brakeman and fireman filling the locomotive tender with water from the standpipe. And in the left window of the locomotive, you can see either a fireman or engineman looking out. And 2 men on the operating deck near the spoke operating wheels. 2 men on the upper deck above them, and an engine and fireman on the wharf locomotive, all seemingly very interested in the photographer. And one last view of the wharf from just west of the reservoir, which is on the right, shown with its perimeter hairpin fencing, an illustration of how massive this whole facility was in its heyday. And what remains of the wharf today? This is the front of the main stone abutment at the south end of the wharf, where coal-loaded hopper cars on a circuit track rode onto the wharf structure. When I gave this presentation 2 years ago, I stated that it still existed, but unfortunately it was torn down in late 2023 as part of an approved development plan for the coal wharf property to construct a multi-unit residential development. Still in existence is the concrete retaining wall I pointed out before, adjacent to Lancaster Pike, which is the north wall of ash tunnels. The remaining foundations on the south side of tracks, and that's adjacent to track 1, the 2 in the distance are the ash bucket conveyor chain entrances to the south end of the ash tunnels. And that would be right here, this one on the map. Here's a closer view of the west ash bucket conveyor chain entrance, which guided the empty bucket chain back into the ash tunnel. And looking down into the conveyor chain entrance with debris evident, but an opening on several sides to whatever space is there. Some sheet steel from steel duct column still lines the sides of the opening. And the easterly conveyor chain entrance, which is filled with rocks and debris. The foundation behind it is the base stone for the southeast stone pier and steel column in support of the ash house. Next. And of course, the gatehouse, as it can be seen today by a development approval agreement between Cal Township and the land developer to preserve it as part of the historical record of one of the most historical railroad sites in southeastern Pennsylvania. I'll close the presentation with a couple of views of interest on the Coal Wharf property. Next. Here under the wharf is a PRR Class D13C 440, number 929, built at Altoona in 1893, with what I believe to be the PRR pay car taken about 1915. For each pay period, a pay car on each PRR division would visit all the major railroad facilities where numerous men were employed to deliver pay envelopes for all the workers. I believe the railroad paid every 2 weeks. Next. And here's a part of the valuation map for the area showing the track siding on the westbound side of the railroad, but oriented in an easterly direction and curving north toward Lancaster Pike and the word Thorndale. It ends on a raised wooden trestle that I believe served as a coal transfer track where hopper cars loaded with coal would be spotted to release the coal to a bin below. The coal was bought by and used in local businesses and residential homes for their heating systems. And it relates to this next photo. On July 2nd, 1913, H6A number 2611, built by the Baltimore Motor Works in 1905, ran off the end of the trestle and partially onto Lancaster Pike. The photo shows the work crew and foreman on the right in white who would be assisting in the cleanup. The reason for the mishap is unknown. This photo was given to me by the late Cal Township resident Dudley Lighty, who lived close to the railroad in Thorndale and was head of the Pennsylvania Railroad Technical Historical Society. For those of you familiar with the current location of businesses along Lancaster Pike in Cal Township, this mishap occurred right in front of Wendy's restaurant. Next. And with this final slide, a view of the Thorndale Coal Wharf looking east toward Downingtown. Thank the Philadelphia chapter and its assembled guests for inviting me to give this presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it in spite of our getting started glitches. Thank you all, guys. I'll take any questions you may have. It was 1915. I'm sorry.
So they were anticipating First World War.
Yeah, that is correct. In 1915, it was coal buildup all over many portions of the country. And that was before World War I. And the government basically notified, kind of on the side, to many of the transportation facilities to stock up.
On the opening slide, or the opening with Gianantonio, the small, looked like a lantern at the very foot of the ash pit.
Yeah.
Would that have been a precursor to a blue light?
No, that little thing down at the bottom left-hand side is a jack. Yeah. That's a very strong jack that was used occasionally, for whatever reason, something needed to be straightened on a locomotive or something like that, but just to push something up, that's a portable jack, just happened to be sitting there. Question is, when was the coal pier taken out of service in Thorndale? I originally thought it was 1953, but our good friend Lynn Bongart researched his MP 229s and other information he had, and the timetables. Yeah, Lynn reviewed his timetables, and there were references up through 1958 to the fact that the coal wharf was still there in the timetables. Next.
So if I may.
Yeah.
So we have some comments and questions here. I have lived, this is from Charles Crawford. I have lived since 1987, only about a 10-minute drive away from this fantastic former PRR site. Are any drawings of the wharf still extant?
Yes, we still have drawings of the site. As a matter of fact, just recently, I got complete plans of the entire structure. So if you want to model it, come see me.
All right,
It sounds big.
photographer friend and former coworker was living in the Glenlock station. Okay. That was from Charles Crawford also.
Okay.
Pierre Lacombe, hopefully I'm saying that last
Yes,
name
that's
correctly. There are about 55 PNC railroad stone sleepers near the reservoir. How are the tracks under the coal hoppers loaded other than tracks 1, 2, and 3, and 4? From Ed Sproles.
If I understand you correctly, the question is, how were the tracks under the coal hoppers loaded other than tracks 1, 2, 3, and 4? Well, they were.
I'm sorry, I was trying to ask, how were they designated? Were there numbers
Oh.
or letters or something?
Yes, I was going to mention that, but I didn't want to get into the details. Tracks 1, 1, and 2, as I mentioned, were relocated to the far southern part of the yard. 1 and 4 remained where they were. 3 and 4 remained where they were. There were more than 50 numerical designations of the tracks and segments of tracks. Some were through tracks, some dead-ended, some switched back to the further west side of the yard if an eastbound train was coming in. So it was really too difficult and confusing to go and explain in a presentation like this. But thank you, Ed. Yeah, one of the statements or questions here is repeat where the circular stone building is located. You can still see that today on the developing property. They just opened up the property, and I think the total property was 119 acres, if I'm not mistaken. I saw that number recently somewhere. But you can drive through that property and you can drive right past that building at this point in time. And there's a sales office there too, in case you want to buy a home on the original property. Look like beautiful things, but they're being built all over the property, and some of the roads are still not constructed, especially on the higher southern end of the property.
Last question I see is how many people were required to operate the facility?
Good point. Okay. In the summertime, about 8 to 10 people could operate the whole facility. In wintertime, that rose to about 18 people. There were 3 classes of workers on the thing. There were coal men, wharf men, and ash men. And there was a very good article in the Keystone magazine many years ago, forget who did it, about the Denholm coal wharf, and it explains a lot about the operation of the facility.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Al. That was a fantastic presentation.